Good morning and welcome back to the Explicit Measures podcast with Tommy, Seth, and Mike. Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Hello, Mike. How are you this morning? And happy Tuesday, gentlemen.
There we are.
Oh, it's a Tuesday. Yeah, so jumping in with a couple announcements and things that we've found across the internet. There's a lot going on right now. There's a lot moving and shaking right now. Interestingly enough, a new version of Power BI Desktop, I believe, has been released. However, we still don't have a Microsoft blog kind of outlining all the features yet at this point. So, what have you guys discovered so far in the new, I guess it's October desktop release?
Or mid-September desktop
Or
release?
mid-September?
It's a silent release.
I just opened it up and it says October 2023. So it's an October release.
It's an early October. Well, yesterday I was perusing the LinkedIns and saw a post by Zoe Douglas, Senior Product Manager for Microsoft Power BI, making the announcement that they're calculation group authoring in the Power BI desktop now.
All right, there we go. Calculation groups.
Pretty cool.
This is something that's been, calculation groups have been there for a long time, but you had to write the code to make them happen inside Tabular Editor 2 or 3. So this is a pleasant surprise. Now that it's coming into desktop, I think people will actually maybe start attempting to write some calculation groups. What are your thoughts on calculations groups in general? Do you use them often? Do you have like a specific use case when you want to use calculation groups?
This is an interesting one because I don't think they're utilized as much as they should for the majority of Power BI users. I think when this comes out in the modeling view and when people start downloading it, they're going to go, what's calculation groups? Again, for those who are initiated, it's probably you're listening to SQL BI, you've been listening to Kurt Buehler, you've been listening to Bernat Aguelo from Spain, and you probably have Tabular Editor. That's, I don't know, I would say maybe 15% of people, if I was to guesstimate, have Tabular Editor on their computer.
Okay.
And of those, how many are actually utilizing calculation groups? It's tough because if you're building reports for someone or building data sets, are you handing off calculation groups to a client or to a team that has never used it before?
Therein lies, I think, my predicament with calculation groups. I like the idea of them because there are a number of calculations. You'll do a sum of like time-based calculations seems to make a lot of sense for a calculation group. I have a sum of some sort of sales, and then I want to modify that sum of sales by certain time periods. Last week, last year, just different patterns on how you want to calculate a time-bound sum across some calculation in your model. So the calculations group, I think, really do help out a lot for that. However, how to get that visual to interact with the calculation group sometimes is a bit interesting and maybe slightly strange, because if you don't have the right filtering properties on that visual, it can't decide what measure to pick. So it's like, how would you describe calculation groups for a new user? Like someone who's never okay, cool, they're out. Like, why are they valuable to me? Seth, how would you explain kind of to a new user what a calculation group is?
I mean, in some degree, it's just a collection of measures that are very similar, right? That you can extend and use in an easier way, I guess, than like manually creating every single one. I know, I'd also say it's more of a enterprise feature, right? Like teams that are really well versed in Power BI models, like have to build out things that where calculation groups are really useful. But yeah, there's a ton of caveats to them, right? So is the lay person going to use them? Yeah, probably not. Unless they get really excited about DAX and modeling, and you're like, yeah, I'm gonna own these things. But it's nice to see that it's in the tool, because that way, it's not one of those features that is buried and you would never know about it unless you use third-party tools. Now, I could make an argument that you should always use Tabular Editor, but
true.
I think it's nice that they brought visibility into at least the functionality, because a lot of the things we talk about, are features or tools or things that 90% of the audience doesn't use anyway. Does that mean that we don't find them useful? No, right? It's now that it's part of the tool, I think it's a good feature add. But yeah, I would say it's a limited use.
And I'm hoping to
Even how to build a calculation group at this point, right? You have to go to like the modeling tab of desktop in order to even, I think, create it even. It appears on the home ribbon on the model view inside the calculations group. But if you go to your report view and click on modeling, it's not there. Like, so it's not in, it's one of these kind of like inconsistent experiences. You have to kind of like know where to dig to go find the right setting to make the calculation groups even appear.
It's a bit opposite to where DAX is easy to learn but hard to master. Calculation groups are kind of the opposite because without the necessary configuration up front, which you may not be familiar with, it becomes a catch-all for all your measures. To your point, Mike, we were like, I only want this for my time intelligence. Why is this happening for all of my measures?
Yes. Or how do you build your measures so they're reusable, right? Because it's the idea is trying to make it a reusable measure that you can then inject to other calculations to manipulate it. So it's adjusting. It's a group of filter context adjusted measures, and I think you know that after you've been playing with it for a while. To say that to a brand new person, you're like, "What the world are you talking about?" Interesting. Okay, cool. Another thing in desktop that was released, which again we still have no blog about, so we really don't know exactly what's all been announced or what they kind of improved. But another one that's also there, when you go to the model view, you'll now see there's now a data tab also on that. And one of the features that I kind of like here is they have a tree for tables and for models. So you can look at the tables inside your data model, and you can look at the model definitions of things. On the model ribbon, in the properties pane, it gives you what's your local host server name, handy. What is your compatibility level, handy. And there's another feature here that's called discourage implicit measures. Being that we are the Explicit Measures podcast, we would very much endorse. We would highly recommend this feature. That's kind of what our MO is here a little bit. Is don't just use columns on visuals. You want to discourage those implicit column usages. Instead, you want to explicitly call out the calculations or the measures, and hence the name of the podcast. Even so.
Which makes sense. It's in the modeling view because if you use a calculation group, you can only use that discouraged implicit measures turns on by default, and you can't turn it off if you have a calculation group in your entire model.
Yes, and I think the language on this one, the wording of the feature seems a bit off. It says discourage implicit measures. It doesn't mean you can't make. I think it just says no implicit measures. I think it turns it off. So,
it's not saying you're gonna get a pop of going, we would rather you not.
No, exactly. It's like you're done. Like you're cut off. So I feel like the setting is a little bit misleading there. However, the intent is very good, and I think
what you're saying is just bury a calculation group in every model,
or just turn it on.
Just turn it on. Like so now it's a setting that's always existed in the model, and you could have. So if you had Tabular Editor or something else, you could flip that flag in your model, and implicit measures would just be immediately turned off. So this, I think, it was a requirement because. My understanding is once you bring in calculation groups, you need to turn off implicit measures. So this is some logic Microsoft. Yeah. So you have so if you create a calculation group by default now, they flip that flag, and I guess the situation here would have been if you didn't have this switch, you wouldn't be able to turn off. You couldn't delete the calculation group and then turn implicit back on. So to feature enable something so you could only turn it off and never turn it back on again would be frustrating.
Yeah.
So you have to have this feature released, which probably meant the whole modeling ribbon had to be appearing before you actually had calculations. So there's this is one of these things that Microsoft says, right? Everyone's like, yeah, just put calculation groups in desktop. There's all these other implications that go along with this. Like, how is the UI going to work? What happens when you turn it on and everything goes implicit disappears? How do you flip that back on? Where does that come from? How do you select it? Like, there's a lot of work that had to get here. We had a whole new menu. We got another whole new properties option screen just to get calculation groups. So it was a lot of work to kind of get it there, I think.
I'm all for this because this is only going to bring more awareness to our podcast because someone's going to see this.
What is an explicit measure?
Right.
There should be a URL or a little link next to that one. Just turn off implicit measures and listen to the Explicit Measures podcast. Link here, found here every Tuesdays and Thursdays, 7:30 a.m.
I'm not going to lie.
When 250 episodes, it'll take a lot of time.
I'm not gonna lie. When I do training and we do the DAX part of the training, whenever it's like, oh, well, you always want to use explicit measure part of the name of the podcast, kind of thing. Does it ever occur to you? It always goes through my. Have to mention it.
That's funny. It's funny because at that same kind of comment too, Tommy. I've been on a couple of calls, and some people have been looking at when I go on a call, I still use the microphone and kind of the setup that we have here for the podcast. And I get a lot of people responding, going, "Oh, am I on a podcast now?" I'm like, "Yes, this is Joe Rogan with Power BI," and they laugh. They have a good, it's funny. But then at the end of the meetings, I kind of close it, going, "I feel like I should just say like and subscribe," and they all just die. They're like, "Oh, that's funny."
People, if I'm on a radio show, I go, "Might as well be."
Exactly.
Right.
So that was one of our major announcements. New desktop is out. You can go download it right now from the Microsoft Store, or you can go get it from the downloads area on PowerBI.com. So those, you can go get those there. Other announcements. Let's jump over to the Fabric roadmap. I think this is pretty important for us. Seth, I think you were kind of this one. Maybe you were kind of picking up here.
Thing, I think.
Oh, this is a Tommy one. Sorry. So there is now a Microsoft aka.ms /Fabric roadmap, I believe, is the new roadmap. And so now there is kind of like a roll up of all the features that are coming out from Fabric now. So admin and governance, OneLake, data warehousing, engineering, data science, real-time analytics. So they're trying to, it looks like they're giving you kind of a window into what's coming down the pipeline. I think Alex Powers, I feel like he was saying something on Twitter about getting a new report for Fabric, because Alex Powers has the release pipeline or release notes for whatever Microsoft produces for their releases on the roadmap things. I think he's building one now for Fabric as well. So I'd heard some notes about that on there as well. Anything that stood out to you guys? Did you have a chance to look at any of those things or roadmap related things?
Two things. It's significant that they're doing a release plan now separate from the Power Platform and Dynamics, because previously every release plan, Power BI was always in the Power Platform scope.
Interesting.
And now we're separating Fabric. But Mike, there's one I think you're going to like. This would have been my secret
modeling in the web.
Yeah. Past that.
Oh, okay.
In Q4, this would have been my secret Santa to you that we normally do every year.
Okay, all right.
Folders in the workspace, Q4 2023.
Oh my goodness.
In the workspace.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Where is that found under? Is that found under the Power BI?
OneLake.
On the OneLake, okay.
Yeah. And then underneath that, persistent filters in workspace, which I really like, because I'm always using. I never used the filter feature in workspaces until Microsoft Fabric.
Until Fabric, yes. Yeah. And just Tommy and I have been doing some training things. We're just kind of learning Fabric and trying to digest it. Just making things inside Fabric is incredibly confusing. And from a logical standpoint, there's only so many artifacts that I could make in there. But for whatever reason, there's like tons of lakes, tons of things. Like within like an hour, we had at least a page worth of artifacts showing up inside Fabric, which was like, this is absurd. Like, you're going to need a better way of organizing this stuff.
I think every time we open our workspace, I want to apologize. I'm like, sorry, I made it messy. I'm like, wait, I didn't create half of this.
Exactly right. Well, and if you did, it's like, I try to be organized with it, but it just kind of, it's like you just run by your desk and keep throwing things down on the on top of the desk, and now it's just a pile of mess. Like, like spend some time cleaning it up. But there's no way to clean it up.
Yeah, except if randomly your paper is split into 3 every time you put a paper on your desk.
See, naming matters. Right.
Naming
like
matters.
This is exactly why there are naming standards, because folks who had to deal with systems where it's like, nope, this is a STD underscore. This one is VW underscore. This one is, whatever underscore.
SQL Server is a good example, because they didn't have folders in like the views for SQL Server. So you had to kind of come up with a better naming schema. And then if you're in SQL, because you don't know the difference between a table and a name of a view, so everything, every view,
you don't know that there's actually a folder for views. You know.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there is just for one views, right? You can't make folders and inside views for different types of views, right?
Yeah, there's a few other cool ones. I don't know.
One top level.
Yeah,
it's just one top level. It's like all your views go into one.
The first part underscore is always the most important, because you just zing. Just scroll down thousands of tables.
And
Did
then
you
And the right
don't you love it
space.
when people want to save the views and they have like, deprecated, or like they start putting like,
underscore DEP.
XXX
do
in front
not
of it.
Underscore, yeah.
Yeah, because then you could push all
Because
those views to the bottom of the list.
You break dependencies too.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So you're like, can I delete this? I don't know. Let's
I don't
just
know.
rename it and see. And then all of a sudden it's like
we can always rename it back.
Oh, I'm in the X's. We should probably get rid of this stuff.
That's funny. That's actually it's a real technique, right? People in IT are like, is anyone using this? I'll just shut it off and see what anyone whines about it. If they don't whine about it, then no one's using it.
Yeah.
Because people make it stink when there's a problem, when something's broken.
Did you find any other goodies? Because I did.
Yeah, give me another one. I haven't had a chance to really look through the Fabric.
My favorite experience in the world, data flows, which again I've been talking about since my daughter was born, because it's literally the same time that happened. So incremental refresh support, enhancements to the output destinations.
Good.
Yeah. So finally being able to say, hey, you know what? This entire data flow is meant to go to this one lake. So just make everything go to the one lake by default.
Yeah, I've been finding that to be very painful. Even if you don't want all tables to go to the same location, it would be nice to just say, I'm going to multi-select. Yeah. I mean, I need, it's probably more of the exception than the standard, right?
If I'm creating Gen 2.
Yeah, I would probably make everything go to the same lake, and then I would just remove one or two. Like, I don't need these, I'll just turn them off.
Right. The only purpose to create a Gen 2 data flow really is for the output destination. That's why you're doing it. Copilot and Data Factory. So the first instance of Copilot in the Fabric landscape, which I think is significant too.
There's a whole bunch of those. There's Copilot in notebooks. There's Copilot in Data Factory now.
That's the best one.
It'll be interesting to see how this lands, and how well this will. I've been experimenting. So another company that I use a lot of with data engineering exercises is Databricks, and they're very forthright and they're very advanced in their notebooks, and they've got their own AI or kind of like a Copilot version that helps you build code in there. And I found it's helpful. It definitely keeps me from having to go Google a lot of things. There are some interesting features where you can take like a code snippet and like immediately add it to your notebook and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see Microsoft's take on how Copilot is going to roll out, because it's kind of coming everywhere. It's all over the place. Like Microsoft's really pushing Copilot for all of Microsoft Office stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how effective these Copilot options really are. Anything else that stood out to you, Tommy?
I think those are some of the big highlights for me.
So
there's obviously a bunch more, but we'll keep with those.
There's one more thing that's also in the release notes. You're talking about there's a lot more motion around Data Activator. So I haven't played with that one enough yet to really know where it makes sense yet. But it's definitely talking about real-time data in motion, when something occurs, then doing something else. So it seems interesting in nature. I'm just not quite sure how I leverage it yet to find good use cases. It did, and I think they're just starting to get they're enhancing the triggering. Yeah. They're allowing monitoring for KQL sources. Like it seems like it's still it's late to the game, I think, compared to everything else in Fabric. They kind of announced it at build when it came out and said, oh, by the way, we're going to have this thing. But now it feels like it's starting to come real, and it's actually becoming a part of the product now.
It's what dashboard alerts should have been.
Well, Johnny, thanks very much for the note there in the chat. I'll read your Data Activator blog, and hopefully it's really good and informative. So, Johnny, I have questions about it. Help me out here. What's going on with the blog around this one, so we can kind of dive in and get more around what that looks like. Excellent. Any other thoughts or openers there? All right. The only other note here I'll add is Microsoft has introduced a number of new icons. So your icons now will have color. And that kind of corresponds with this folders area. So it seems like some of the colors of the icons somewhat match groups of, data flows Gen 1 is purple, data flows Gen 2 is green, right? There's some language that they're trying to use here for these different icons and colors of things. So you'll see that come out into your tenants if you haven't noticed it already inside Fabric. I think the colors are welcome. I like them better than what they were before. It's still just would rather have folders at this point. So I'll just keep.
Just give me the
It's coming. I just got to be patient. We'll get there, right?
And let me color code my folders and
Right.
Mic drop.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, all right. With that, let's jump onto our main topic for today. Tommy, give us a quick introduction for our main topic: star schema and fabric. Where is this going to go?
I am intrigued where this topic is going to go. So the premise today, we're talking about a lot of fabric projects, and Mike, you and I have done a bunch of projects. A lot of people are obviously testing out different alternatives to what they're doing now with a normal Power BI data set.
Mhm.
And I think there's a question worth asking on when we're building a fabric project or when we're in this new modern landscape. Does the star schema and the importance and it being a cornerstone of our normal development still apply with the normal fabric one lake, with the fabric lake house, and with the normal development? Is it still a cornerstone of everything we build in the top of the mountain, or is there kind of a different priority now as we're building fabric projects?
This is a good question here. So, you know, I'm going to probably in my opinion here, I'm probably going to take the conversation a bit larger than star schema. I think star schema is definitely a portion of this. So I'll say it this way, and this is something that I kind of learned from SQL BI, so I have to give them credit for the knowledge that I've gained around this. Power BI, or at least the cubes, the models, they're great at filtering and aggregating. That's what they're meant to do. So whenever you're building cubes, you're always thinking about how can I build or structure my data in a way that forces it to be filtered and aggregated for your measures or whatever you're trying to calculate. That informs some of the shaping of the data in dimensions and fact tables. I feel like, and this is my impression on doing some model building for customers for a number of years now, as I look about or as I present data models to users to consume, right? So I think of myself as that person who's in the role where I'm the data modeler and I'm building models for other people to consume. I feel like it makes more sense for people to consume a star-based model. These are the dimensions. This is the factual table. The measures always come from the fact table. And then these various dimensions are what are used to filter, or, the measures make up the majority of the data points on the chart, right? The dimensions are all the x-axis or y-axis, depending on you doing modeling. I think for new users to Power BI, this is the way to go. Like, it's very easy to understand that. And if you're building from a thin report layer, you can see the different measures, or you can see where the measures are in tables, and you can see how the tables relate to each other. Even though you may not see the actual formula for the measure, I think just having the idea of I can see the tables and understand how they filter down to the main table or not is very helpful. So I feel like one of the main documentation pieces I like to provide is, for every fact table, if you're pulling measures from this fact table, here's the dimensions that impact that fact table. So I typically will do a diagram, especially if we have a data model that has 3 or 4 fact tables in it. I'll have one diagram with all the tables shown with their relationships in case you really want to look at it. And then I'll break it down and say, okay, for each fact table in this model, here's this fact table, here's the dimensions that go along with it. While there are exceptions to the rule, I find most pages in a report usually use 1 or 2 fact tables. It's somewhat simple. At least that's how I design my models anyways. So I'll just pause right there. I said a lot of things.
Well, I think it's worthwhile going briefly back to the future on why the tabular model is so important in Power BI, because it uses the VertiPack engine. It's a columnar-based database where it really, in order for it to work, and the reason why it is so efficient, because it takes thin amount of columns with many rows. That's why our CRM is always so frustrating to try to immediately load in Power BI. That's a row-based database. It takes a lot of columns, a lot of fields. Power BI utilizes the VertiPack engine from importing, which is meant for a lot of rows with a lot of thin columns.
And it's interesting you're going down that route with that kind of topic, Tommy, because this is a really interesting point. I feel like there is to your trying to put the thought here together. from a operational side of things, the transactional data system, right? When
Right.
you have people actually editing individual records or adding data into a system, doing the daily work, you're adding row by row. You're locking out this row, you're editing in that data, you're putting it back in, right? So the transactional system is more of a row-based piece of information. And that's built by app developers. That's
Right.
what they want to put in there. When you move over to the reporting side, we need to look not across just individual rows of data. We're focusing more on looking at an entire column. Like I need to see all of the sales for an
And
entire
linear.
year,
Mhm.
right? So you're doing more of this aggregating and filtering. I need to take a lot of little tiny data points and roll them up or aggregate them into bigger amounts of information. And to your point, Tommy, that's why the tabular store that the VertiPaq engine delivers is so powerful. It's literally
design.
storing the data in a different format. It's smaller, it's more compressed. And this is where I think Fabric becomes very interesting to me, because the Delta format that everything Fabric uses, from data flows to pipelines, whenever you're writing data down into your lakehouse, by default, you're getting this columnar store of information. And for me, the really neat thing about Fabric is now that Power BI, literally the analysis services engine, can now read direct lakehouse tables and immediately load them into memory. That's the awesome part, because I can now, it's like doing all the VertiPaq work before VertiPaq, like in the lakehouse now. Like you've moved one whole entire step right in front of it, that makes it really easy.
No, I completely agree.
I find it hilarious that as we're talking about the new features and updates of an October release that are not released, so I almost wonder if people are listening to us and somebody's like,
oh, someone forgot to press the button.
we forgot to push the button on the October release. So Tommy just hit in our internal chat here.
Oh, look at
if
that.
you want to check out the Power BI October release that has just dropped. So
I'll grab the link and I'll put it in the window here.
I do
definitely
appreciate.
forgot.
I just want to say that I appreciate Microsoft has now synced their releases of
with our
blogs
podcast,
to
yes.
the major podcast announcement channel in the world, the Explicit Measures podcast. So thank you, Microsoft. We
Send us to
appreciate that
Ignite,
one.
Microsoft. Come
Yeah.
on.
I mean, it's
We'll
early.
do your introduction.
It's early for them right now in Microsoft, right?
Well,
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
We'll save looking at that
Sorry
for
for
Thursday,
the
but
segue.
yeah,
I just couldn't leave that in the
That's
ether
funny.
in the back end.
worthwhile.
Well,
Hey, guys,
stay tuned for next month when we'll release the next blog for November.
You heard it here first, guys.
Sorry,
Well,
Tommy, you were saying.
Yeah.
Or Seth, you were saying.
No, we're traversing a lot of the reason for star schema and columnar
Sure.
storage of the VertiPaq engine, right, is behind the scenes, regardless
Huge.
of how you set up
That's true.
the objects within your model, right? I think where it's in the same way that you're talking about a production system, right? Data stored is typically not repeated. But when we explode it out, especially when we're talking about sales data and all of the accoutrements that go along with it, a lot of data starts to get repeated, right? So this is where, even in databases, you go through this process of normalization, which basically means you're removing any repetitive data to save yourself space. And this used to be a huge thing when you only had a finite amount of space, right? This is why, like, machine planning, the amount of RAM, like how much memory you were going to consume during the year was a big thing. And now we're just like, ooh, like, give me more.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking about those same concepts in star schema models, you're normalizing your data. You're removing all of the repetitive data out of giant tables, right? So if you have the one record, but then include all of the product information, the titles, the whatever, and that's just repeated information, you're wasting space, and ultimately your model gets to a size where that starts to have detrimental impacts on the performance as you're trying to rip through and aggregate and do all these things on top of that with the DAX language. So I think that's like the key part for me, and why there's a reason why, like, star schema has been, the de facto way to go, build and do these things, whether that's from the warehouse moving forward, where you're implementing surrogate keys, you're implementing, slowly changing dimensions, and then where Power BI is realizing that same structure. It's not like you went from this structure to a brand new one. It's like, no, this is the most performant in all of our places and the best way to do analytics, right? So I think that's what stands out to me in the star schema perspective. I guess my question is, are there any new aspects of Fabric that would challenge that star schema?
So my initial
Or did we create a clickbait title?
No, and I think I have two sides of the coin here. On the first side is, well, if we're still using utilizing DAX and utilizing Power BI, we're still going to live in this world of designing database design or tabular design. So that's like the default answer I would have. However, the devil advocate side I have, and I've been going back to this at the turn of the century. There's a lot of talk about like man has reached this pinnacle of inventions, and like 3 years later, the Wright brothers came out with the airplane. And I feel like we're also at this other point now with Fabric, with Direct Lake, that we don't know yet, in a sense, how efficient it can be. We also, if we're going to be using Direct Lake rather than import, to your point with Delta tables for the first time on all aspects of what we're using in databases, I think there's still a lot we don't know that it can really play into whether or not the normal tabular model with you have to have the thin columns and or the thin columns with a lot of records still makes the most sense.
So you're making the assumption, and a pretty large one, that the direct lake mode was it like structurally so significantly different than the past.
I don't know if it's using VertiPack engine the same way.
Well, so from what I glean, VertiPack engine has been enhanced to not. So what you would provide to VertiPack engine would be a SQL query. It would provide you a row level detail of table, and the VertiPack would read that into memory and then compress it. So the VertiPack engine makes partitions, it makes groups of things, it does all these little, makes these little tiny files that, or groups of files that allow you to take a table with row level data and delete basically all that information that's repeated in rows, and then in a as optimized as possible way, only store the columnar level data. So that, to me, that's what the VertiPack engine was doing. It's doing some data engineering, shaping. You can manipulate it with M, but the VertiPack engine really is doing that compression and serving that columnar store of data to the visual side, right? So queries, you can basically write SQL against it and get out answers, or you write DAX against it and then out comes answers, right?
Right.
So what I think, to your question, and maybe Tommy, to your point as well, like I think what's happening here is the VertiPack engine just has got an enhancement. So instead of just doing VertiPack engine's proprietary format, the VertiPack engine just now is able to do the exact same thing it was doing, but now there's delta tables, and the delta tables are what's doing the, that brings the engineering upstream. So from my perspective, when I look at this, I'm thinking, turning my head or my mindset, right? When Power BI Desktop came out, we did everything in desktop. You imported, you made measures, you made relationships, you did everything you needed to do to build that report. It started from raw data to report in one tool. It was in desktop, and then you could only do it in desktop. Where I think this is interesting to me is we started in a place where the single tool did everything. Now we're at another place of this where we're looking at the Power BI.com service has now been adding additional breakpoints further and further up into the data engineering ecosystem. So instead of writing my M, making my tables, and do everything in desktop, we're actually pulling away more and more things away from true report building at this point. And I think what we're doing now is we're bringing other Microsoft tools closer to where the report or the integrations is becoming tighter. So I see this as what's happening here is the size of data is increasing. The tools we're using are getting more modern. We're adopting some more modern lakehouse type architecture pieces. But what's happening is we're pulling out more and more things from desktop. So initially it was data flows where just the M code could be stored in the lake, right? But we still had the VertiPack engine, so you'd still have a CSV file with lots of rows of data in it. When you refresh your Power BI data set, it would still go read that file, compress it, and then from that compression, then it would store it in the model. What we've just now added with Fabric is now the compression side of the VertiPaq engine has also been moved outside of, the data set side, and now that is controlled by something inside that Microsoft ecosystem and Fabric.
So while some of the underpinnings are changing potentially, right?
Yes.
Where we're leveraging, Delta Parquet, et cetera, the engines and how they operate across, a star schema, denormalized dimensions,
Sure.
or normalized dimensions, denormalized fact table, right? Where you're reducing the same principles are still applying as far
Yes.
as, structure of data and how it's going to
100%.
work most efficiently.
Yes. And I don't think so. I guess what I'm saying here is what I feel like we're doing is we were given a tool that had everything in one nice, pretty box. And then here you go. As data increased in size, as we need more control about all the different things that we're trying to do, the tool is now being expanded. And what we're seeing adaptation of pipelines and notebooks and all these other things that can prepare data upstream, which is a traditional data engineering exercise, but now all of it's just incorporated into a single Power BI Fabric ecosystem, which now it still does the same stuff. You still connect to data, you still make column stores of information, you still serve it in a cube, and that still goes to the report. So all those are the same, but now you're seeing distinct tooling pieces kind of appear because now Microsoft is enhancing each of the tools all along that path. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting as more of the business gets involved, because I think the opportunity to do that in Fabric is probably the best out there, right?
I would agree.
In terms of
Yes.
this new theory, and it's not a new theory, but it's breaking down the silo between, like, I was just watching another conversation on this yesterday where the argument was business should own everything reporting related, not IT. And it's like this siloed old version of IT, right? But I think we've seen over the years, I think this mix of people who are deeply engaged in the business, trying to solve business problems in the BI space, already bridging that gap between traditional IT and the tech stacks. Whereas now we have a platform where it's not like, oh, I'll give you permission to 4 different things and you need to navigate and figure out like where all this stuff is. Now it's just part of the same workflow.
Mm.
And where this gets interesting from my perspective, I think, is if you start building things in such a way and modeling data from source systems of data that they know, and all of a sudden it starts to make sense, even from a lakehouse build structure. Really, the Power BI side is then just plugging into those objects. It's not even having to remodel or rebuild or do things.
Yes.
So like that's like phase 2, but phase 1 is, hey, do you know, like, if you structure and build things right the first time, right? Let's take a brand new business area. If you go into that area, and one of the best things about Power BI is I can connect to multiple different data sources. I can do all the ETL. I can do everything in that tool.
Yep.
Is that going to scale infinitely? No, we've talked about that. You need enterprise systems to do that. Now you have like, hey, Fabric is this ecosystem where I can connect to all your different third parties. I can pull in the data, but how do we build things? Well, how you build things is how I already built this for you. If you use your original Power BI build as the like phase 1 of data discovery, figuring all the transformations, doing all the things that you would need to like produce business value, then you can use that as your guide for how you build those in the Fabric ecosystem, which is essentially just the enterprise ecosystem. Right? Saying, hey, we need to build these objects, and actually here's the kind of the structure, your architecture, and then let's enhance that because we have these new tools. But now all of a sudden, like, everybody's part of that work stream, and they can easily, I think, understand what it is that an engineer may be doing, right? And it may not. I still don't assume business folks are going to jump into Fabric and be able to do all the data engineering.
No.
But if it's set up and it's structured, and they're still the owners, or they understand how and where we're doing business logic, I think it scales a lot better in that environment than any other that we've been introduced to.
That's a significant point. I don't think that should be not underrated, but undervalued one on what you're saying here. So think about the idea where if you were building Power BI before, everything was built on top of that same engine, all within Power BI desktop, all within that particular model. The refresh, the query transformations, the modeling, and DAX. Now that engine and the processing's coming from multiple different sides, where your transformations are coming from a data flow Gen 2 and just getting pushed as, in a sense, a static table into the lakehouse. Your DAX calculations are coming from the service or coming from the model that's not within that Power BI model. So all the efficiencies, all the things that you would normally build that would only, in a sense, bloat up your model is, in a sense, I don't want to say irrelevant, but kind of gone, where you would have to be so conscious of that, which is a big point. And we've talked about that grow up story of a model to the enterprise. But I think that the bigger part here, just from the efficiency point of view, is the fact that the engine, the processing is coming from multiple different engines now. It's not coming from just Power BI desktop.
So I'm taking a lot of notes here on both of your comments, and I think I agree very much with both of the comments you're having here. And I'll just kind of add a couple notes around here. Seth, I really liked your idea about having the organization stand back and actually say, what do we care about? Right? I think a lot of times we focus on like the weeds of things, right? I have a need around, I need to rip out a little bit of data from Salesforce. I've got to attach it to some internal data that I have. I'm trying to blend it with something else. It's a very narrow view of what that data set should look like. When you step back and have someone more like, when you have a tool like Fabric now, you can really, to your point, Seth, like step back and say, what do we care about? What is the bigger picture around our data for our customers? We have products, we have customers, right? How you get to those tables of information and what you do to make sure your business runs, you can now have broader conversations around, well, yeah, we should have a products master table. Okay, great. Who owns it? Where does it need to live? We're going to make one in Fabric. Who should have access to this? What does that look like for the entire organization? So to me, I feel like what is happening here is we're in the middle of what we've been talking about for a long time is these data silos that exist in organizations. Everyone kind of does their own thing. And unless you have a central IT team that everything is beholden and they hold everything with an iron fist because all the data must come from that single department, right? That's the only department that can kind of see the data joins across departmental things. So what I feel like I'm seeing here is Fabric is this tool that's going to enhance or allows us to have a broader view of all the departments, all the things that we care about, and we can really start having conversations about here are central data things that we care about. The other side note around this one as well is I think now with Fabric, we need more visibility, or we're getting more visibility around responsibilities of data. Governance is becoming more important, in my opinion. Data stewards and identification of data stewards, who owns the data, is becoming more important, because previously IT owned everything I connected to with an import, right? That was somebody else. You own the server, you have everything else upstream. I don't deal with it. I start at the import portion of Power BI, build my data set how I want, and then output a report. What I feel like is happening now is we're drawing that line further upstream, and now I have more lines or more people that can be involved in the process, which means better governance is required, right?
Yeah.
Who owns the product table? Who owns the customer table? Where does that data come from? And what happens when the data comes into our systems where it's legit, out of date, incorrect, wrong? Who's going to go back in and fix that information? We're now able to see those conversations now. And as in my mental model here is we now have permissions at the lakehouse, a workspace, a data set, and an app. These are all different layers deeper into where the data is being created that we can now provide new access points around individual people. And I see OneLake Security playing a very pivotal role in this.
Yeah.
This is really important, Mike, because Fabric is more about the end goal being just a Power BI data set. And more organizations are acquiring or having data science teams, utilizing notebooks, utilizing machine learning. It's not required is a tabular model. It's not a requirement to do so. Notebooks, even Data Wrangler, right? Like us playing around with that. Well,
love it. Super cool stuff.
but the tabular model doesn't make sense there because you have to merge all that into one table. So
True.
there's more and more applications in Fabric, or if I'm pushing to like a Power App or Power Automate now, all the integration where the tabular model by itself, I don't want to say doesn't make sense, but is not as applicable as a normal Power BI model.
And
So
this is where, but again, I want to keep emphasizing here. I think what we're doing is we're getting more visibility to governance, right? So to me, what this is really just accelerating in my mind is if what you were just mentioned, Tommy, right? I have like 3 or 4 different ways where I can make data, right? I can make it through a pipeline, I can make it through a data flow, I can make it through a notebook, I can make it through a Kusto query. I can now do data activator. Like now there's so many different compute engines that can kind of push data around, do different things. Like what is the right mix of these things and who owns them? Because if you just stand one of these up, there has to be, to some degree, some documentation and a little bit of succession planning, because you can't have someone in marketing owning products and then leave or get promoted, go somewhere else. Because what I see a lot of times in organizations that are starting out in Power BI, if leadership can't have the full vision of Power BI, individual users of that Power BI environment become very successful. They do really well in their department, and the users themselves learn Fabric and can do better stuff, but they outgrow the policies and the people inside the organization. So I see it often. Someone shows up, they get really good at Power BI, and the leadership can't recognize how good they're doing and how they're adding value. And so instead of pivoting to enable that person to do more, that person leaves. They go to a different company or start their own thing or do something else to a company that actually is adopting the mindset of, we're going to step forward, we're going to do things with Power BI.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny how many crossover points we have with something I just listened to yesterday. Like I said, C-suite buy-in, 100%. If an organization is going to do it, like have long-term change or have an opportunity to build data culture and literacy across an organization, there has to be C-suite buy-in, particularly just for what Mike talked about. I think the point I want to make, right before earlier, and then we can dive down into like build this is. Fabric and that ecosystem and all the points you were hitting, I think we're aligned to or push for why we keep talking about having clear objectives that all teams align to, right? And this is the importance of having OGSMs or OKRs as an organization, because with a mind for data, because that allows these teams to link up where they're good and figure out how do we build what the business needs and solve these problems in a way that is both solving the business problem as fast as we can and looking for sustainability. And I think, like Mike, this is where it's like, think like the business, act like IT came from, because we've been in this world for a very long time, but where we still have problems without without a C-suite buy-in, without objectives that the whole ship can link their things to, and without good interaction between the business IT, you're not going to win.
Yes.
And the main reason is because business teams, their main focus is rapid solving problems for customers, right? Where they need to focus from the IT perspective is thinking about long term. Plan ahead, dudes. You do the same stuff. Figure out what the overall solution is for your problem. Make a request for the singular report that's going to solve everybody's problem when they add a filter, versus 100 of you making the same request with little variation and differences. That's what kills a BI team.
100%.
Right? So that's where tech teams come in. They're like, no, slow down. Like, I'm IT, I own all the data.
Yeah.
We need to build this in a sustainable, scalable way that you guys can reuse all this stuff. And the next time you ask for something, it's going to be a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
But what they don't get is, guys, the business moves so much faster than this. How do you produce something for them in an iterative fashion that is going to be useful, that solves the objective, or at least gets us to a point where everybody's on the same page for long-term company building strategies, as opposed to just throwing sticks at each other across departments.
Yes.
And I think that's the fun part about business intelligence in general. But new platforms like
sticks?
Fabric, yeah, totally. Sometimes rocks too, right?
I am
Well,
more
I think
on
that's
the
the fun part about being in business intelligence is we've been in this world for, I think, longer than a lot of folks, but now are getting like Power BI was it. Now Fabric, I think, accelerates or pushes that even further into the business and saying, hey, let's come along for the ride. Everybody's trying to, or not everybody should be going along the same path towards the same objectives. Here's how we're doing that. And all of us understand how that's happening. You may not understand all the technical parts of it, but I'm still going to produce the same things with higher visibility for you because I want you to be part of the journey. Ultimately, and it rides into your other part of the conversation where it's going now, which is ownership of data. I don't own everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
You have the business logic. You have the business knowledge about all of the intricacies into, I think, Johnny Winter's point, all the case statements and all the special exceptions that have to happen in data that like produce the numbers that are spot on. Like, you know that. You guys are the subject matter experts. So either we're working extremely close with you, or you actually skill up and level up into these platforms where you know how to interact and how to modify the data that's going to get refreshed and pushed into the reporting.
So I'm going to say a statement.
It's a fun ecosystem.
Based on what you said, I'm going to say a statement. I want you guys to tell me if it's an overreaction or not.
Sure.
Overreaction.
I was just going to do the same thing.
Just kidding.
Head on. You got it right.
Yeah. Tommy, you walked right into that one.
I know. But this is what is Seth is saying. Based on the new technology landscape and the data landscape that we live in, the importance of collaboration, committee, and process is going to be more important than the skill itself in the technology. The skill and having the right process is going to be more important than the skill and just the technology itself. The reason I say that, the reason I say that, so it isn't over. The reason I say that is because you're now working with so many teams there's going to be so much crossover, how you actually implement a project and how that process is handed off and how that process, the conversation, the communication, that skill is now risen above the technological skill.
No, it's all, okay. No, I think what you're outlining is that all of these challenges and breakdowns that are happening in organizations where things don't align between IT and business is a direct result of that. I think all of that is going to come forward more in conversation where there has to be good hands-offs. There has to be a good process that we develop. There has to be a strategy that someone is developing along the way to make these teams understand how all of this is supposed to work.
Right.
To Johnny's point, we talked about people, process, technology. One is not more important than the other. They all have to work in sync with each other for any of these projects to be successful.
Sure. That's why I phrased it as, would you overreact? Is that an overreaction? Mike, is that an overreaction?
I think the language is a bit too strong in my opinion. So I think I would align with Seth on this side. So I like to think of it as being balanced, right? There's always three parts of this one, and people will add maybe more things in there as well. But I think it's like people, process, and technology. You can compensate with weakness in one area by overcompensating in another. For example, if your people aren't skilled up enough to use all of Power BI, you can enhance or you can strengthen that part of the three-legged stool by adding more technology. If you don't have solid process, you can lean more on your people to develop or devise how they're going to release things. So you don't have a strong process, but you can then lean on the people and or the technology to kind of help you build some of the process. One thing I'm thinking as an example of this is like deployment pipelines, which, by the way, as I've been reading the Microsoft blog here recently, you can now have more than 3 environments. So now Microsoft has just opened up multi-deployment pipelines. You can have 4 or more deployment environments for your Power BI artifacts, which is kind of cool. But that is a technology solution. What I would say would be a weakness inside potentially organizations, or particularly the business, of getting things from dev to production, right? We don't have a solid check-in, check-out process on things. Therefore, we use a deployment pipeline. If we follow that, the technology enhanced a weak process that we have. So for my opinion, it all has to be balanced. And to say, the technology is going to overrun other parts of this, I think is a misnomer. Because I don't think there's any one silver bullet. You can't focus only on one area and expect it to be really successful.
Well, for the sake of argument, I think it's an overreaction too. But what I'm trying to say, the need to implement a good process is ever more important now because of the technology. Like, this is not something that can survive like we could in the past with just one person developing.
And I'll add my little term on top of this. Governance is what's needed, right? So process
more than ever before.
Process coincides very well with this whole governance thing, right? So my idea here is you need more governance because now more than ever, you can connect anything to anything, right? Tommy and I've been playing around with Fabric. You can take a data flow, you can build some data engineering off of Lake A, and you can do engineering to it, and you can drop it in Lake B. So you can now use data flows to move data between lakes, between workspaces. And again, what I talked about earlier was there are now permission levels at the app, the data set, the workspace, the lake house. There's all these different layers of permissions that you can give access to people. So now, in my opinion, it becomes way more need around just trying to be organized. And so I think what I feel like this is doing is the same thing that Power BI did. Power BI turned report building into a commodity. Anyone can build a report. It's a commodity. They're all over the place. So what this accelerated for me in my mind was the need for certified data sets, certified reports is now becoming, I think, more important for organizations. These are things that someone or some team has some rigor or process around. To your point, Tommy, the process piece. They're going to put their stamp of approval on that thing. Now, add to that all the other things that come along with Fabric. Where does that sit? Like, do we have certified lake houses? Do we have certified workspaces? Like, how are you going to engineer? Like, so the same rigor you were doing only in IT can now be brought further and closer to the business. So now we need better process around how do we administer and govern these things? How do we get good data out the door all the time? Because what I don't want to be doing is running around on a weekend trying to figure out why my data set won't refresh.
And what we also found out, Mike, it's also way too easy to delete a table in Fabric in a lakehouse.
Maybe, like, yes.
There's no
what
box that says,
Are you sure
you want to do this?
There's no drop box when you drop a table. Yeah.
So we were Tommy and I were doing some Fabric. We actually did a Learn Fabric yesterday. And while in our testing of this, you can use the same SQL command or where you say drop table and the table name, right? So you would do in Databricks.
Any table.
Great. It just removed the table. But
yeah, I mean, they're welcome to the back end.
Well,
yeah.
But in Databricks, though, like if you did it in Databricks, you can drop the SQL table, but the physical table still exists in files on the storage account. So I can't in Fabric. I couldn't see like
Fabric actually cleans.
I don't know. I can't see it.
Oh, that's interesting because
maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know yet because I can't see what's inside the one lake. I can't go to the lake house and like literally search for or scrape through. Like, okay, here's the one lake. Does it have a container for tables? Does it have a container for files? Yeah, and can I go to that container and actually see what's there?
Just kidding. Let me plug into my last version of this.
Yeah, like oops, I didn't mean to delete it. Let's recreate it. Like there's some weirdness there where I don't get to see all the things that are happening inside the lake house. So yeah, you're right. It's not about the cell, Alex. You are 100%. I love lakehouse storage, and this is the reason why I like it so much, and particularly Star Schema stuff things as well. This is all the stuff that I've been developing for the last 5-6 years outside of Power BI, and I'm super enthused about it because this is the first view of the world we're getting that says we're going to bring all this really rich, multi 10-year plus new data warehouse development. We're going to bring that forward. We're going to bring it into Power BI. And from the business user perspective, business users get a great deal. Like we are getting so many new features, which is awesome. I'm not sure this is a great sell for the data engineer and the data scientist yet. I don't think there's enough features well rounded out yet for those personas inside Fabric. But if nothing else, it's allowing us all to play together in the same ecosystem. And I'm sure Microsoft is going to continue to close the gaps. And they're definitely listening to what can they do to improve it, so that way they get a premium experience for all people: data scientists, data engineers, data modelers, all the way down to the report building experience. And I like the direction they're going.
So all in all, I think star schemas for the win, right? Performance,
Always.
usability of downstream calculations, they're dependable, repeatable results. There's a wealth of knowledge and documentation online. The downsides still remain the same, right? Like it requires people to understand them. So there's a knowledge gap probably for brand new users, and a little bit more planning when you're developing and building reporting. I was reading one thing earlier where somebody was like, well, yeah, can't we just get away with not doing them? He's like, yeah, till a point when you have to, right? Like, and what he had done, and he'd been with a company for a long time. He's like, yeah, I just built them. And now I spend all my time rebuilding all of these reports I built because of models. And I think what this is going to drive in this conversation, especially between IT and business teams or business intelligence teams, is there is going to be, and is starting to be, a rapid back and forth of value to system constraints. And this has always been there, just at a much slower pace. And now what we're saying is, hey, yeah, here's the tools, here's the keys to the castle. But if you trash the castle, somebody's got to come in and clean it up, right? So if to not get yourself in a position where all of the sudden this rapid building without any foresight creates a massive problem that your organization has to solve, either by spending an inordinate amount more money or going back and refactoring things. It's really important, to Tommy's point. I think the stress should be there on process and strategies to ensure these teams understand what this new ecosystem looks like, and that we're a team. We aren't two different competing priorities. We're all aligned to the same objectives. And that obviously leads to the fact that organizations need to have these teams on the same objectives, on the same boat, because the larger an organization is, the harder that boat is to turn, right?
Oh, 100%.
So this is where the breakdowns have happened in the past, where it's like, oh my gosh, we just launched this year-long initiative and IT's been going down this direction, and we are an aircraft carrier, and you just introduced this to the business, and the business is like, no,
I don't need that.
like
Right.
that's
Why is it taking
not
you so
what we
long?
need to build.
Not
And
what I
it's like,
want.
okay, well, now we're 6 months before we can turn the ship. I think the tools and technology are to a point where it's focused on solving the business problems, and that's exciting, but it also terrifying for technologists, because it's like, man, there's a balance here. We all got to be on the same page with things you don't understand, and you don't need to, but I'm here to help you solve your business problem, and here's, like, let's develop these processes and do this together.
Yeah, my last 2 cents. I think no matter what the output is, we have more outcomes than ever before. If you're still playing in the world of DAX and the DAX language, star schema is supreme. Star schema is by design how DAX works efficiently.
Yes.
Regardless if you have the best engine in the world or works differently. If you're still even just working in DAX, which you are in a Power BI data set or in the Microsoft Power BI world, DAX reigns supreme. Star schemas reign supreme.
And I think I'll also emphasize this as well. I think new users don't understand the value of the star schema. I think as you mature, you get more comfortable with it, and you understand there are more data transformations you need to do upstream. So my one word of advice here is, if your DAX is getting very complex, if you're doing a lot of iterations on top of your data, this is a good opportunity for you to start thinking about, how can I reshape the data so that it makes it better for reporting? And I really do think, it may not be a true star schema all the time. You might have many facts and dimensions that serve those things. But I think once you really start understanding how valuable that star schema is, you start focusing a lot of your engineering effort upstream to support the downstream star schema development. And that really does, it shakes out a lot of business requirements and really makes you understand them to get them into a place that when the word I hate right now is allocations. Whenever I hear the word allocations, that just means a whole lot of work. Maybe I shouldn't hate it. Maybe I should just start seeing dollar signs when I see the word allocation. So whenever I hear the word allocations, that's when I start seeing dollar signs, because that means the business has a different view of their data than what the the operational system has today, and we have to reallocate or reshift those data points in there, which again, that just takes work. It just takes effort. So I really like Fabric. I think this really enables our discussion. We can have better conversations around what this is looking like. But at the end of the day, the data sets should be star schema. You now have a wealth of other new tools to shape and add that business logic outside of the data engineering modeling side of things. You can now do that in Fabric and other places, which I think will be very beneficial for teams and people to really start building. All right, with that, we don't have any other announcements or other things going on. That was a really good episode. We may have talked about star schemas a bit, but maybe more broad patterns in governance and people and process as well too in this episode. We hope you liked it. We hope you enjoyed the conversation here. Thanks everyone in the chat. Some really good comments. I got to call out a couple people here, Donnie and Donald and Johnny. I was trying to put your both names together. Donnie. Thank you very much for your comments. You guys were awesome. Some really good thoughts and some really added value to the conversation. So really appreciate you guys jumping in and into the chat as well. If you like this conversation, if you think someone else would benefit from it, we'd really like you to share it on social media. Let somebody else know you found this was a good conversation and you enjoyed what we were talking about, and that Michael probably messed up your name. With that, Tommy, where else can you find the podcast?
You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to subscribe, leave a rating. It helps us out a ton. Do you have a question, an idea, or a topic that you want us to talk about in a future episode? Head over to powerbi.tips/podcast. Leave your name and a great question. Finally, join us live every Tuesday and Thursday, 7:30 a.m. Central, and join the conversation of all of Power BI Tips social media channels.
Man, you're getting good at that. I like it.
I wrote it
getting,
down. I'm telling you.
It's getting dynamic now. I like how you're reading.
Yeah.
Like
better and better.
That's awesome. Yeah.
Helps when you know what you're going to say.
Exactly right. I just wing it a lot of times, so I just make up things.
No.
Anyways, that being said, have a great week, and we'll see you next time.